Hello and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris. You're watching Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. My guest today is economist Dr Terence Gomez. He's formerly with the economics faculty at University Malaya. His research when he was there really focused on Malaysia's political economy, the linkages between politics, policy and enterprise development. So it's good to have him on the show today. Terence, thank you for joining me. As we're recording this, it's Thursday at 2 p.m. And the cabinet lineup has yet to be announced. Is that something that should concern us, Terence, that the cabinet hasn't been announced yet, or is more deliberation a good thing?
We must remember that this is a coalition government. We never before had a hung parliament. And this is the coming together of parties, not by choice, but because of the insistence also of the king. I like the idea of a coalition government. I like the idea that different parties representing different segments of society are now in government. This will now entail more dialogue in government, and that can only be good for Malaysia. However, your question to me was, is it a good thing that the cabinet has not been appointed yet? I have to say, I have my concerns. Why is it taking so long? The fact of the matter is that in this coalition, we also have the Barisan Nasional. And the Barisan Nasional, there were leaders in the Barisan Nasional who had serious allegations of corruption against them. And one of the core issues during the election was the electorate made it very clear. We are saying no to corruption. And there's a possibility that the next deputy prime minister may be a person from UMNO who has serious allegations of corruption against him. Now, my sympathies are with the Prime Minister. He has to balance this out. He has to decide how does he accommodate people with serious allegations of corruption against him. Should they be brought into Parliament, into Cabinet? And I think this is a good thing. He's thinking about it. He has to weigh the pros and cons of this. But my own opinion is he should not appoint in the Cabinet any member of Parliament who has got serious allegations of corruption pending against them.
Okay. What does he risk if he does?
Well, as I said during the election, one of the core issues, and Pakatan themselves stressed this corruption. Corruption in government, including in the Ministry of Finance. Now, if he goes and appoints a deputy prime minister or finance minister who has serious allegations of corruption against them, he's perpetuating a system that he had said during the election he would stop, he would reform. How do you reform a system when the person in charge of the reforms himself has got serious allegations of corruption against him? As I said, this is something Anwar has to think through very carefully and decide how he wants to move forward, given the situation he's now in.
Okay. All right, Terence, I want to talk a little bit about the finance minister post. Again, to be clear, at the time of this recording, no announcement has been made yet as to who will be the finance minister, but there's been no shortage of speculation over who should helm the finance ministry. And some people have actually argued that it's actually the second most important portfolio in cabinet, not the DPM post. You've done a lot of work about looking at the concentration of power in the finance ministry. I want to talk to you a little bit about this, the power that the finance minister holds. Can you share with us more?
To answer that question, Melissa, let's go back in history. If you look at Malaysian history, Malaysian political history, in the 1980s, Mahathir had a serious problem with then finance minister Razali Hamzah. And what he did was he sidelined Razali and he brought in someone from the outside, Datuk Zainuddin. Now, the reason for that debate was because Mahathir, as prime minister, had a serious policy difference with Razali. And there was a check and balance there as to how to go about doing it. Subsequently, let's move forward. Mahathir had appointed Anwar Ibrahim. And this was in 1998, soon after the Asian financial crisis. There was a problem between Mahathir and Anwar because Mahathir wanted to bail out certain people, including members of his own family. And Anwar had said no to it. This led to the removal of Anwar. Datuk Zainuddin was then brought back as finance minister. And then later, from my research, it was very clear there was a problem between Mahathir and dime over the Banking Consolidation Act. And Mahathir removed dime. And then Mahathir decided the Prime Minister should be the Finance Minister. At that time, already we said this won't do. The Finance Minister cannot be the Exchequer. But he had his way. And when Abdullah came to power, Abdullah recognized that the Finance Ministry was so powerful, but since he was a weak finance Prime Minister, he did not delink the Prime Ministership from the Finance Ministry. And when Najib came to power, the same thing happened. Najib recognized that the Finance Minister is extremely powerful, so why remove the post from under his control as Prime Minister? He kept it to himself, and we saw the consequence of that. Now, Pakatan, when they came to power, they promised us in their manifesto in 2018, they would delink the Finance Minister from the Prime Minister. And that happened. That was a good thing. And the reason why they delinked it was because we saw when the Prime Minister controls the Finance Minister's post, he has control over a significant number of GLCs in particular. And this led to scandals such as 1MDB, Tabung Haji, Felda, all controlled ultimately by one man. And this is why there cannot be any link between the Finance Minister and the Prime Minister. And that's just control of the GLCs. What about control over public policies, implementation of public policies? So there are a lot of issues here in terms of the check and balance between the Finance Minister and the Exchequer, which is very good for the system. I want to end on this note. Anwar did say he is considering whether he himself as Prime Minister should take up the post. Now, given this history, should Anwar go down that route? No, he cannot do that. I would like to point out here too, let's also look at history. When Muhyiddin came to power, Muhyiddin appointed an outsider, what he called a technocrat. Ismail Sabri kept the technocrat in power. So they maintained that. So why go back to a system which we know has serious implications in terms of good governance? Anwar should not do this.
So do you think there should be more technocrats in this role? Should we have more bankers as a finance minister?
That's a very good question, Melissa. This is something we got to think through. When a technocrat, when an outsider was appointed as finance minister, in this case, Tunku Zafrul, let's look at the context. The context was that we had a serious crisis, a pandemic, a health pandemic which led to the closure of the economy. The government had to intervene, and to intervene even more directly in the corporate sector and to help people in distress. And he appointed Tunku Zafrul, who was in charge, who had a long history of being in charge of GLCs. And Tunku Zafrul came in and said he's going to use the GLC ecosystem to save the economy. And he did it. He used institutions like the banks in terms of reducing the moratorium on interest rates. They had Tenaga Nasional reducing the rates for power supply, and so on and so forth. So you could see this is why the Ministry of Finance is so important. It controls huge segments of the corporate sector, which can be used to help an economy. It can also be used in the manner in which it is abused, as we've seen under Najib's administration. So that's the question we have to ask ourselves now. Are we in a situation now where we need a technocrat? My answer to you would be this: not necessarily so. Now, why do I say that? Let's look at the structure of the finance ministry. It's huge. They control GLCs. They also control regulatory institutions such as Bank Negara. They control institutions such as the Securities Commission. They also control development institutions such as LADA and statutory bodies. And what are the issues that we have to debate here as finance minister? There's arguments that we are caught in a high middle income trap. The arguments of the digitalization of the economy. There are things about the gig economy. Now, are we saying that there's one person who is the know-it-all to deal with first this wide spectrum of institutions, as well as this wide spectrum of issues that need to be tackled today? I'm sorry, I'm afraid that won't do.
Okay, well, so what if there was a second finance minister role, finance minister two, that post was created? We had one before. I think Jogani was in that post. I mean, does that provide more of a talent pool? Does that provide a check and balance because it's a coalition government? Or do you see that merely as expanding the cabinet?
It's merely an expansion of the cabinet, and we don't need that now. I'd like to go back to previous experiences that we have had, where how was this tackled? and I go to Pakatan when they came to power in 2018. Let's take the Minister of Trade and Industry at that time, led by Daryl I. King and Ong Kian Ming. What did they do? They had a lot of problems to deal with with regards to the economy, and they set up an advisory committee. And the advisory committee comprised people from academia, from the private sector, from unions too. And that's a good thing, because here we have a dialogue going on between government, business, and labor. And we want that kind of compact, social compact, where the voices of different segments of society, labor, economy, business, and government are sitting around the table and discussing public policies and advising the minister and the deputy minister on ways to move forward. Can't we have a system like that? And let me remind you, I was in this committee too. Let me remind you, it was non-paid, and we met regularly. And they listened to us. We were even allowed to go and talk to bureaucrats on certain issues. We were allowed to visit agencies to talk to them when they were promulgating certain policies. That's a great system. And ultimately, the power lies with the minister, who then takes it back to the cabinet, who also has to discuss this in parliament. Now, what's wrong with that system? Why can't we have a system like that where it's an open, inclusive system, which is what Anwar Ibrahim said. He wants an open, inclusive system where different voices of society are heard, and where the minister gets an opportunity to hear the voices of different segments of society, along with the bureaucrats. Then he decides what next do we do and take it to parliament. I would propose a system like that under the new government, rather than depend on one person to save the economy.
All right, we're going to take a quick break here and consider this, but we will be back with more on this topic in just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Hi, welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. My guest tonight is Terence Gomez. He is a professor, formerly a professor with the economics faculty at University of Malaya. He's recently retired. During his time there, one of his key research areas was Malaysia's political economy, the linkages between politics, policies, and enterprise development. Let's talk a little bit about GLCs, Terence, the practice of rewarding political allies and loyalists with cushy GLC positions. That practice has been in Malaysian politics for a long time. Is this a culture that Anwar can change?
He has to change this. If we go back to the new economic policy, which was introduced in 1970, they created public enterprises, and that led to greater state intervention in the economy. These public enterprises were active in the economy, and they did a lot of good things. But subsequently, these public enterprises were privatized or corporatized, and then we saw the rise of GLCs. Now, everything, whether it's Khazanah, which is a sovereign wealth fund, or whether it's EPF, which is a pension fund, or whether it's Tabung Haji, they're all called GLCs. But actually, GLCs mean many things. They mean statutory bodies, holding companies, sovereign wealth fund, special purpose vehicles, and also companies. So there's a whole range of institutions that fall under this thing we call GLCs. And we know for a fact, when I wrote the book, Minister of Finance Incorporated, we were shocked to hear from even Ministry of Finance people that they had no clue how many GLCs there were in this country. It had become, and I like to quote here Mahathir Mohamad himself, when he was in the opposition, it had become a monster, a huge ensemble of different types of institutions, completely out of control. And we saw now how it could be abused when Muhyiddin came to power. Muhyiddin, when he wanted to consolidate his position, he couldn't give people positions in cabinet. He gave them senior GLC appointments, which allowed them to have extra income. I'm bringing up the Muhyiddin point because we have a similar situation today. You cannot accommodate too many people in the cabinet. So do we give them GLC appointments to pacify them? Now, GLCs can be an institution through which you can also reach the ground. The Ministry of Rural Development, for example, has control of many statutory bodies that have their roots right into rural areas, including the poorer states, the Malay heartland states. If you have a government which does not have much inroads in the Malay heartland states, which is a core constituency given the malapportionment that exists in this country and the gerrymandering that has gone on in the past, this is a very powerful ministry. And there are politicians who wouldn't mind being appointed to head these GLCs, which gives them an opportunity now to make inroads into rural areas and to use these resources for their political purposes. So this must stop. It must stop immediately.
Well, if it were to stop, do you expect there to be repercussions, backlash from those who expect the gravy train to continue?
Unfortunately, these are some of the issues that Anwar has to consider very carefully, because I'm glad you raised that point, Melissa, because when we talk about GLCs, we must link it to policies, public policies. This is not going to be an easy time for the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister, as leader of Pakatan, said, we should move away from race-based policies and support needs-based policies. Many of the GLCs that were instituted were brought in to implement race-based policies. So your point about the gravy train, it raises an important issue. While these GLCs were implemented to help poor people, especially poor Bumiputras, were they really used for that purpose too? This is where, again, we've got to go and look at the whole GLC structure and recognize which institutions to be key and which are completely abused institutions. What function do they serve? If we have GLCs to help the poor, I will say, of course, we've got to keep them. But should it be needs-based or race-based? That's a question also the government has to decide. So GLCs, remember this, I started off with the new economic policy, and it was created to help implement the new economic policy, which is a good policy, targeted at eradicating poverty and redistributing wealth equitably. They did very well under the NEP. Look at the poverty rate in this country. We have seen the rise of a new Bumiputra middle class. All this can be attributed to the NEP, which also used GLCs to get this done. But they were subsequently also hijacked by politicians to serve their vested interests. And for example, in the procurement policy is to help develop Bumiputra enterprises, but it's not transparent. Who gets them? It's supposed to go to Bumiputras who have entrepreneurial capacity, who can develop these concessions and get, but it doesn't even reach them too. So you can see here the whole system is being abused. So we got to look at this very carefully. If you're looking at the GLCs, we also have to look at the relevant policies. We have to have a debate about these policies. So the current government has a lot to discuss now. Do we implement needs-based policies? And which are the GLCs we want to keep? Well, the rest, we can disband them. We don't need them.
Well, I mean, that sounds like a lot of reform to tackle, but it's not the first time. It's not something new. It's been long discussed. There's research. There are experts who have been bringing this up consistently. What do you think, Terence, should be the main thrust of reform in terms of the economic structure? What should Anwar, he's already said he wants to focus on the cost of living issues, but that's a very immediate term strategy and policy. When we think about economic reform for Malaysia, the structural issues, where should Anwar begin?
I'd like to go back to your first point. We've been discussing this for quite some time, but we have not seen any change. Let's go back to that defining moment in 2018 when Pakatan came to power. And when Pakatan came to power, they had said at that time, in their manifesto, we are going to move towards needs-based policies. The Prime Minister, however, Mahathir Mohamad, when he took power, said he's going to disregard that manifesto. This speaks to the issue of political will. It can be done. It should be done. There should be debates about this. But they didn't have, at that time, a prime minister who had the political will to bring about what had been promised in the manifesto. And therein began our problem. You remember they had a Malay Dignity for conference, completely negating what was in the manifesto. And they subsequently came up with the Shared Prosperity Vision, SPV. And it was a replica of the new economic policy, which has now passed its time. So here, the government knows what to do in terms of public policies. If you look at the manifestos, they have a good idea of how to even tackle serious economic issues. I gave you some ideas in terms of the administrative form in which you can go about to tackle it. Do they have the political will to do this? Or will they look towards consolidating their political power? That's what we should watch out for. Now, I would give Anwar the benefit of the doubt, because Anwar was not the prime minister at the time when Pakatan came to power. And the Pakatan manifesto, to my mind, were written by people who were more aligned with thinking which was not in line with Mahathir, what Mahathir wanted. They now have the opportunity to implement what was stated in that. I refer to the 2018 manifesto because it was a very well structured manifesto. Go back to that, look at that. There are many ideas there in that manifesto which talk about the reforms that need to be implemented.
Right.
I hope they have the political will to do it. This is my concern. I want to close on this point. This is a coalition government. It's going to be difficult. There are many issues here that needs to be discussed. Different parties will have different ideas as to how to go about it. They are not party to the manifesto that was written. They had their own manifestos. So how do you find a compromise? And this makes life quite difficult for the prime minister. So these are the issues, unfortunately. We have to go through it, but that's good. We are having this.
Well, another thing that's going to make life difficult for the Prime Minister is the expected downturn next year. It's going to be a tough economic headwinds are expected. And when the global economy, situation for the global economy is tough, the austerity mindset kicks in. And that was what we saw with the Pakatan Harapan government under Tun Dr. Mahathir. Because of the debt the country was in, he had this austerity mindset. The backlash was significant. I think a lot of people didn't like the idea of this austerity drive. Do you think that this might be, how do you think Anwar should play this? He has, he has decisions to make that take into account the fiscal health of the country, the fiscal health of the global economy, and trying to keep a population happy, given that he was not, this is a coalition government, trying to keep his government happy and the voters happy. How do you see that balance, Terence? It's not going to be an easy one.
It's not going to be an easy balance, but let's talk about some of the low-hanging fruits that he can look at. And interestingly enough, he's already addressed it soon after he came to power. The issue of subsidies. Now, the issue of subsidies is something Pakatan tried to deal with, but the way they went about it was probably not proper. Just the wholesale removal of certain subsidies, especially those that were targeted at rural areas. And there was a backlash against Pakatan on this score. Now, this comes back to my point on needs-based versus race-based. We've got to think through these subsidies. Anwar just said it. When he came to power, he called in the key economic people in his government and he told them, look at the subsidies and those who don't need it, don't get it. Now, this is a difficult issue to implement. If you go down to the ground, I was doing some research in Kelantan, Terengganu, as well as Sabah, Sarawak, and we were visiting rural areas, and they were talking about subsidies. And some of the most entrepreneurial businessmen in these rural areas told us the subsidies are a problem because the subsidies are just evenly given out to people who then abuse the subsidies. While people like them, if they get the subsidies, they could grow even more. They got additional support. They could move up the ladder. They could expand their businesses, but they didn't have sufficient money for it. Now, this I'm giving you a response from the ground, which talks about a serious issue. How do we deal with the subsidies? How do we distribute the subsidies? Is there any monitoring of how these subsidies are given out? That's just one example. I'd like to come back to the other example. We've talked about this today, and I'll repeat it, the GLC system. The GLC system comprises a multitude of companies, and these companies have a multitude of directors who are given stipends. That's a huge burden on the government's resources. Now, just by removing many of these companies and these directors who get these stipends, we already have a huge savings there. Now, these are just some of the issues which can be quickly addressed. But again, this comes back to my earlier point about political will. If you do this, what are the implications on the ground? And as you know, as we speak, the opposition parties, which are also already playing up this issue, and if I may add, racializing it. They are racialized.
Right.
And we don't want to go down that road. We've got to be careful. The issues that we are tackling, we are based on whether they are appropriate. And if they're appropriate, yes, we do it. But we have to be careful about how they can be racialized. And we saw this when Pakatan was doing it, how it was very effectively racialized to turn people against Pakatan under the Mahathir administration. We're seeing similar trends happening now. And I'm very fearful about this. And that's something the government will have to guard against.
Terence, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the show today. I appreciate your time. That was Terence Gomez, formerly from the Economics Faculty in University of Malaya, and that wraps up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.